A teenager who just turned 15 in September is now accused of murdering almost his entire family. But one of his sisters says she played dead before escaping this house of horrors and telling a neighbor what really happened. We're going to break down the most shocking details as judicial authorities tried to figure out if the accused killer should be tried as an adult. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. The early morning quiet in Falls City, Washington, about 30 minutes outside of Seattle, was broken October 21st, when a series of 911 phone calls brought law enforcement from multiple agencies to a gruesome crime scene. The Humistons, a family of 7, lived in a large house on a lake, and inside that home, 5 family members were found dead. Parents Mark and Sarah Humiston had been shot to death, along with their children, 13-year-old Benjamin, 9-year-old Joshua, and 7-year-old Catherine. Who could have done this? Well, that is where this takes an even more disturbing turn. You see, authorities say it was Mark and Sarah's son, the brother of these siblings, that committed this massacre. A 15-year-old boy who we aren't identifying right now, but he was arrested in the driveway of the home. But he is not the only one who was alive in that house. No, rather, the only surviving family member of this shooting, the suspect's sister, an 11-year-old. She was the one who alerted neighbors to the horrors that were happening inside of that home. By the way, what do I talk about all the time here on Sidebar? I talk about the law, right? I talk about legal rulings, legal decisions. Well, I have a landmark one for you right now that has just changed things in a massive way. Why? Because you can now legally trade on who will win the 2024 election. Yes, that is legal. And that is because our sponsor of Sidebar, Kalshi, went to court and won legal approval for election trading for the first time in over 100 years. So not only can you essentially bet on the 2024 presidential election winner, but with Kalshi, you can bet on who will control the House and Senate, who's going to win the swing states. Tomorrow, big day. And it's not just politics, by the way. You can bet on other future events, too, like will Taylor Swift win Top Artist on Spotify this year? What's going to be the Rotten Tomatoes score for upcoming movies like Gladiator 2? I actually think it's going to be above 85% personally, but there is so much more. You're going to be like, wow, I can trade on that? Yes, this is the only place to trade on events like this in all 50 states. And right now, you can sign up using our link, kalshi.com/sidebar, or you can scan the QR code on screen. And if you're one of the first 500 traders who deposit $100, Kalshi will give you a free $20 credit. That's kalshi.com/sidebar. But back to the story. So it is being reported that right now, this 15-year-old has blamed the shooting on his younger brother, that he was the one who did this before turning the gun on himself. Really twisted stuff here. But the question becomes, does the forensic evidence provide a clue as to whether or not that could be true? So to talk about this, I want to bring in crime scene investigator and host of Crime Scene Confidential, Alina Burroughs. Alina, thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate it. Before we even get into it, deaths of families like this and allegedly committed by one of the children, so whether it's even the 15-year-old or the 13-year-old, and I'll lay it all out, those I have to feel are some of the more difficult cases that you can possibly respond to.
They're difficult, and fortunately, they're not that common. When we see events of parricide, which is killing of a parent or a close family member, a lot of times they have to look at the past behaviors of the family member that did this, if they had anything particularly diagnosed, and if there's neglect or abuse going on in the household.
Yeah. Let's talk about it. Let me lay some of this out for everybody. So according to sworn testimony from a detective with the King County Sheriff's Office, dispatchers get a 911 phone call from a teenager who we're going to be calling AH. This again is the 15-year-old suspected shooter. So this 911 phone call happened just before 5 a.m. on October 21st. Quote, AH sounded out of breath and stated, "He just shot my whole family and committed suicide too." During the ensuing conversation with the 911 operator, AH stated that his brother, BDH, had killed their family and, quote, taken himself out, and that he, AH, was currently hiding in the bathroom on the main floor of the house. AH stated that a possible motive for BDH killing everyone is that he had been caught looking at pornography the night before and that he was about to get in a lot of trouble. Okay, so AH says his brother is the shooter and that he's holed up in the bathroom. Then, just minutes later, 911 gets another call from a neighbor up the street. And this is where that 11-year-old girl, this sister, comes into play, because she had apparently come to the door, ringing the doorbell over and over again. And again, this is the 15-year-old sister. And this little girl, called BAH in the affidavit, quote, told them that her family had been shot and they were all dead. The neighbor relayed that BAH was injured by a possible gunshot wound and that she was bleeding from the neck and the hand. The dispatcher asked if BAH knew who shot them, and BAH responded that she heard gunshots and screaming, and then she saw AH's face and that AH was the one who shot her. Again, this 15-year-old. BAH then described holding her breath and playing dead. So again, she was shot. We'll get into that a little bit more. But this brave little girl was reportedly able to hold her breath until her brother left the room, snuck out of a window, made it to a neighbor's house, and relayed what's going on. Alina, you have two different accounts right now. What do you make of it?
Well, certainly whenever we have witness testimony and we have physical evidence, we have to listen to the physical evidence, because witness testimony can be skewed, especially considering the trauma that our witness was undergoing at this particular time. And fortunately, our evidence just does not support the story that was given on the 911 call that the child brother murdered the family and then, quote, took himself out, or, whatever he said. Forensic evidence does not support that.
I'm going to get into the forensics in a minute, but I don't think I have ever heard a case like this before, where, putting aside the forensics, you have an account from two juveniles. So you have a brother and a sister, both saying what happened to their family. I mean, I've never heard anything like this before. And it really sounds like it might come down to the forensics, because whichever truth there is, whichever one anyone believes, is equally as horrifying. Whether it was the 15-year-old who gunned down the family, or was a 13-year-old who gunned down the family and then killed himself. I mean, those are, I don't even know how law enforcement appreciates that and tries to come to terms with that without looking at the forensics.
Yeah, very slowly things start to emerge. And I will say that I haven't seen any crime scene photos or reports, but I have looked at the charging documents that reveal just enough for me to be able to say, that the forensics doesn't support this based on what we see at the crime scene.
Let's get into that. So deputies, they find AH in the driveway of the home. And as they cleared the home, they found three people at the bottom of the stairs leading to a basement living area. They were identified as AH's dad, Mark, as well as his 9-year-old brother, Joshua, 7-year-old sister, Catherine. Down the hallway, first responders found a 13-year-old boy, Benjamin, the brother that AH had claimed was responsible for the shooting. And in the master bedroom's suite bathroom, deputies found AH's mom, Sarah. According to deputies, they took AH to the police station, put him in touch with an attorney who told detectives that they couldn't speak with the teen. BAH, the 11-year-old sister, was taken to a hospital. Other investigators did a forensic child interview with her there, and the details that she relayed sound basically out of a horror movie. I mean, BAH told investigators that she shared a room with Catherine, her 7-year-old sister. They were woken up by gunshots. So BAH looks out into the hallway, and she said that she could see her brother Joshua and her dad laying in the hall. She says that her little sister Catherine got up from the bottom bunk and went into the hall where AH allegedly shot her. BAH says that AH then came into the room, pointed a gun at her as she lay on the top bunk of the bunk bed, and she told investigators that she recognized the gun as her dad's silver Glock, and she remembers being shot once or twice and feeling a lot of pain. The affidavit states BAH saw AH leaning over the three bodies in the hall, touching their necks or chest to see if they were alive. BAH said that AH then entered her room again. She closed her eyes, held her breath, and pretended to play dead as he stood next to her bed. Eventually, BAH heard him leave the room, walk upstairs, where he could be heard talking on the phone. That is just, Alina, an incredible account. And also, when you think about those allegations and you think about the positioning of the bodies, what does that tell you?
So likely our shooter would have started with mom and dad in that primary bedroom area, usually because they are more likely the target of any kind of anger issues, but also they're obviously the ones that can fight, they can escape, they can call 911. So this was fairly premeditated to go and take mom and dad out first. What we see from the injuries, dad has 4 gunshot wounds. That's the most injuries of anybody in the house that we have seen so far. And then we have mom, who is in the ensuite bathroom that's attached to that primary bedroom. We have blood near the bed. So that tells us that, this was around 4:50 in the morning. So he likely approaches mom and dad in bed, shoots, I don't know which one first, because I haven't seen the crime scene photos, but mom receives an injury where she's got blood on her and she runs into that primary bathroom, locks the door, barricades basically. We know this because there's blood on the inside of that bathroom door. There's also damage on the door frame that suggests somebody then forced entry into that bathroom. And we have 1 fired cartridge casing in the sink. So mom was shot a total of twice, once prior to running into the bathroom and barricading, once after the door was kicked in, and that was likely to the head. So it looks like this is very systematic. The shots are distance or somewhat close range, followed by a headshot. So he's trying to incapacitate and then really kind of make sure that it works.
It's a brutal execution. I mean, that's really what we're talking about here. And when investigators asked this little girl if her brother had been having, any trouble at home, she told them that he had recently gotten into a lot of trouble for failing some tests at school. Neighbor told Seattle news outlet King 5 that the children were homeschooled, but they were well known, they were active in the community. And the girl also claimed that while the children knew where their dad had kept his Glock in a small silver lockbox that was sometimes near the front door, she said it was AH who was the only one who knew the combination. Now remember, AH told dispatchers that it was his 13-year-old brother who had gone on a shooting spree and then took his own life, but when detectives got to the crime scene, they reportedly found Benjamin with a bullet defect on his left cheek, a large amount of blood on the ground near his head. The affidavit says a black Glock handgun was in his left hand that was lying on his chest. There was no apparent blood spatter that was observed on BDH's left hand or the Glock. And as Alina was saying, Benjamin had been shot twice in the head. The medical examiner later found at the autopsy that there was no stippling around the first wound, meaning it was fired from more than 2 feet away, and the second wound was reportedly likely made from 6 to 24 inches away. Alina, what do you take away from that? Because that's the forensics there. That's what you would suggest, right? That shows the 15-year-old maybe did this.
Yep, that's it right there. We can tell that this 13-year-old child did not commit suicide because you simply can't shoot yourself from a distance with a firearm. You are confined with the length of your arms. And he has 2 injuries. So he has one that has no stippling whatsoever, which is a distance shot, which means it's past 24 inches, 2 feet or greater. I don't know how tall this child is, but if you put a firearm in your hand and held it to a distance, you are likely not getting that type of distance. So when we see the second injury that has stippling or powder tattooing, and what that means is that the firearm is close enough to its target that unburned particles of gunpowder then travel to the skin and sear into the skin. That's why it's called powder tattooing. That indicates that the firearm and the target, in this case, our 13-year-old child, are between 6 inches, no greater than 24 inches away for those particles to then adhere to the skin. So we have 2 different injuries. We have distance and we have that stippling injury. If we just had the stippling injury, it would be a whole lot harder to tell because you can get stippling from shooting yourself 6 inches away. But that distance wound that has no powder tattooing, no stippling, means that this was fired from a greater distance than he would be capable of.
Alina, why is his defense counsel, and this is being reported, they're saying that it's forensically viable that this 13-year-old could have committed the killings? Because is it that they're suggesting that their client, this 15-year-old, had no forensic evidence on him, had no biological material on his body? And A, if that's the case, why would that be the case? And B, is there something else that we're not thinking of, why they say it might be forensically viable that the 13-year-old would have killed his family and killed himself?
Well, I would have to look at the crime scene report. Obviously, there are some things that we would expect to see if it were a suicide. It's not impossible to have 2 gunshots with a suicide, but it's certainly uncommon. So here we're going to have to look to the medical examiner to say if any of those shots would have incapacitated him and prohibited him from making the second shot.
Okay, and then what about the fact that there might not be biological material or forensic material on the 15-year-old if he was the real shooter?
Well, I do know that in the charging document, there was one article of clothing that was found in a bathroom. So it's possible that he wore another article of clothing on top and then removed that article and then left it. If he's pre-planning and premeditating this, it's certainly not out of the realm of possibility.
How tough is it to stage a scene? Because that's what they're basically saying, that he staged the scene to look like his brother did this. But how tough is it to stage a scene for anybody, let alone a 15-year-old?
Yeah, it's certainly something that people try, but they have to remember that while this is their first time staging a crime scene, it is the multiple thousands of crime scenes that the investigators that are responding have worked. So they know when something is off. They know based on where our bodies are, timeline of events, if that would have been possible or not. And fortunately, in this case, we have the forensics to go by, but we also have that witness statement saying that when she looked into the hallway, who she saw deceased, that brother was already deceased, the one that's being blamed for this. So he couldn't have possibly done this when we have the forensics corroborating the witness statement.
Yeah, it's such a little, look, I will also say this, I say how tough is it for a 15-year-old to stage a scene? How tough is it for a 15-year-old to allegedly murder his entire family like this? And what is a very, again, I think if the evidence points to him, a pre-planned execution, and early in the morning, and having an idea about calling police and saying it was his brother who did this, and rearranging the bodies. But by the way, we were talking about the autopsies. Just let me go through this one more time, because Mark Humston had apparently 4 gunshot wounds, but there were 3 projectiles that were recovered from his body. Why only 3?
The projectile could have traveled through and through. So we could see that projectile is somewhere else on the crime scene, either visible or in a wall or in flooring.
Does it also make you believe, because if you look at the difference, Joshua, Catherine, and Sarah, they were apparently all shot in the head, as you talked about. Does it mean that maybe his father, maybe like you said, the biggest threat, maybe he had been coming at him? Because that amount of shots, and you compare it to the other victims, what does that tell you?
Well, when we look at the location of his shots, we have shoulder, we have armpit, we have lower back. That kind of indicates a turning motion. The way that I'm seeing this is that the father obviously is surprised by this act, turns and tries to run, and then collapses. And then that's when the headshot would be probably the last shot. So we see that pattern of a shot to incapacitate and then that follow-up shot to ensure that it's done.
What else would you need to know at this crime scene? What else would you like to know about this case?
I would like to, certainly like most people, we want to understand motive. And I'm very interested to see if he has any patterns of behavior that have been reported. It's harder when he's homeschooled because we don't have separate outside individuals that are observing his characteristics. Failing at tests or having a poor experience in school can be a sign of some, diagnosable mental illness. So I know right now that the forensic psychologist, forensic psychiatrist is definitely looking to the DSM-5 and looking to see whether or not he meets criteria for conduct disorder or some similar mental disorders, because we all want to understand why this is possible.
By the way, one other thing that I was thinking about as you were going through that, when we talk about what else we need to know, and if his attorneys are saying there wasn't forensic material on him, does that mean gunshot residue wasn't found on him either? Do they test for it?
Here's the thing about gunshot residue. So gunshot residue, think about it as something tangible like baby powder. It's comprised of barium, antimony, and lead. So those 3 things together make GSR. And if I were to have GSR on my hands, if I fired a gun, which we would expect that I would, but if you have a bullet hole in you, you will have GSR on you. So the 13-year-old that was blamed for this could very well have gunshot residue on him that is not meaningful because he has a bullet hole in him. He will have gunshot residue on him. It's also transferable. It's also washable, right? If I were to take a shower, if I were to wash, think of baby powder on your hands, you can wash it off. Think of baby powder on your clothes, you could wash it off.
Yeah, and on, if the suspected shooter, it would be on him, so he could potentially wash it off. I also think it's interesting, his account, everybody else was shot in the house except him. And And why would that be the case? The 13-year-old, taking that story as true, the 13-year-old murdered everybody, but killed himself before targeting the 15-year-old. That's something I would like to explore as well.
Sure. Yeah. Behaviorally, it doesn't make sense. The crime scene doesn't add up to that. I don't think anybody is going to seriously consider that, but I think the defense attorney is doing his job.
Yeah.
Or hers.
Look, AH was charged with 5 counts of aggravated murder, as well as attempted aggravated murder in the juvenile court system. King County prosecutors, they want to move this trial, though, to adult court. Obviously, that makes sense given the gravity of these circumstances. He appeared in court last week. He didn't enter a plea. It is interesting to note that prosecutors filed an amended criminal complaint, and what they did was they removed the designation that the crimes were acts of domestic violence. They removed it from 4 of the charges. Officials said that by state law, they're prohibited from moving forward with those specific kinds of charges. Very interesting little side note there. During a court hearing, the attorneys representing the teen said that he has no criminal history. He was just a regular kid who enjoyed mountain biking and fishing. One of the attorneys told the court, "I remind everyone that these are not proven facts, merely allegations, and the law presumes our client is innocent of these charges." He's 100% right. A hearing to determine whether or not AH will be charged as an adult is currently scheduled for June of 2025, and a status conference to get an update on the progress toward that hearing will be in January. Alina Burroughs, thank you so much for coming on to talk about what is not an easy case, a really disturbing case, but really appreciate your insight all the time. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. Speak to you next time.